Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in Savannah, Georgia history. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching us from and the exact time you are listening to this narration. We are interested in knowing how far and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In 1852, the port city of Savannah carried the weight of its prosperity on the backs of those who had no voice to speak of their suffering. Among the grand mansions that lined Bull Street and the squares that marked the city's carefully planned grid, there existed a world of silence so profound that even the Spanish moss seemed to whisper warnings to those who dared to listen. It was in this world that a young woman named Amara Bell lived, breathed, and planned what would become one of the most meticulously executed acts of retribution ever documented in the coastal region of Georgia. The Witmore estate occupied nearly 3 acres on the eastern edge of Forsyth Park, where the cobblestones gave way to packed earth roads that led toward the Savannah River. The main house, built in the federal style, with its symmetrical facade and elegant proportions, stood as a testament to the wealth that flowed through the cotton trade. Behind the main structure, a series of smaller buildings housed the kitchen, laundry, and quarters for the enslaved population that kept the household functioning. It was here, in a narrow room above the kitchen, that Amara Bell had spent the last 7 years of her life in what the Witmore family considered exemplary service. Amara Bell was 23 years old in the summer of 1852, though the exact date of her birth remained a matter of speculation, recorded only in the household ledgers of her previous owner. She had been purchased by Charles Witmore at the age of 16 from a plantation 30 miles inland, brought to Savannah specifically for her reputation as what traders called a house-trained worker. The transaction, documented in Witmore's personal correspondence found decades later, described her as of pleasant countenance, quick to learn, and possessed of an unusual quietude that speaks well of her breeding. What the correspondence failed to capture, and what would only become clear through testimonies given years after the events, was the intelligence that lived behind Amara's dark eyes. She could read and write, skills acquired in secret during her childhood when the plantation owner's daughter had taken pity on her and provided clandestine lessons. More significantly, she possessed what her fellow workers described as an uncanny ability to remember every conversation, every slight, every detail of the daily operations that governed their existence. The Witmore household operated with the precision of a well-maintained timepiece. Charles Witmore, a man of 48 years with graying temples and a meticulous nature, had built his fortune through careful investments in cotton futures and shipping contracts. His wife Margaret, 5 years his junior, maintained the social obligations that their position demanded, hosting weekly gatherings for the ladies of Savannah's prominent families. Their 3 children, ranging in age from 12 to 19, were considered among the most well-mannered young people in their social circle. Amara's duties within this household were extensive and varied. She served as personal attendant to Margaret Witmore, responsible for dressing her hair, maintaining her wardrobe, and accompanying her to social functions where she would stand silently in designated areas, available for any need that might arise. In addition to these responsibilities, she oversaw the preparation of meals for special occasions, managed the household linens, and supervised the younger workers in their daily tasks. To observers, both within the household and among the visitors who frequented the Witmore estate, Amara appeared to embody everything that the system promised when it functioned according to design. She moved through her duties with efficiency and grace, speaking only when spoken to, anticipating needs before they were voiced, and maintaining what Charles Witmore often described to his associates as the perfect balance of competence and deference. Yet beneath this carefully maintained exterior, something else was taking shape. Fellow workers would later testify that Amara had begun asking questions about the household's routines that seemed to go beyond her immediate responsibilities. She wanted to know about the family's sleep patterns, their habits when guests were present, the location of important documents, and the schedules of the night watchmen who patrolled the grounds. The first indication that something had shifted in the delicate balance of the Witmore household came in late June of 1852. Margaret Witmore began complaining to her friends about small items going missing from her private chambers. A silver hairbrush, inherited from her mother, disappeared for 3 days before reappearing in its usual place on her dressing table. A piece of jewelry, a cameo brooch that she wore only on special occasions, vanished for nearly a week before being found tucked beneath her pillow. Charles Witmore initially dismissed these incidents as his wife's forgetfulness, but as they continued with increasing frequency, he began to suspect theft within the household. What troubled him most was not the monetary value of the missing items, but their personal significance. The objects being taken were those with emotional importance to his wife, pieces that an outsider would have no way of identifying as particularly meaningful. An investigation was conducted with typical thoroughness. Each member of the enslaved population was questioned individually, their quarters searched, and their recent activities examined. Nothing was found, no evidence of theft, no hidden caches of stolen goods, no signs of the missing items anywhere within the estate grounds. The objects continued to disappear and reappear with no discernible pattern, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and unease that began to affect the entire household. It was during this period of heightened tension that Amara's behavior, according to later testimonies, began to display subtle changes. She became even more attentive to Margaret Witmore's needs, often arriving to assist before being summoned. She began offering suggestions about security measures, recommending that certain valuables be moved to more secure locations, and expressing concern about the family's safety in ways that, while seemingly helpful, created an undercurrent of anxiety about threats that had not previously been considered. The summer heat of 1852 was particularly oppressive, with temperatures remaining above 90 degrees for weeks at a time. The humidity that rose from the nearby river made the air feel thick and suffocating, especially in the upper floors of the main house where the bedchambers were located. It became common practice for windows to remain open throughout the night, with only thin curtains providing privacy from the street below. This atmospheric detail would prove significant in the events that followed. The oppressive heat created a need for constant air circulation, making it necessary to leave doors ajar between rooms, creating pathways for sound to travel more freely through the house than would normally be the case. Conversations that family members believed to be private were often audible to anyone moving through the adjacent corridors, particularly during the late evening hours when the household was preparing for sleep. It was during one such evening, in the second week of July, that the pattern of missing objects escalated into something far more disturbing. Margaret Witmore awakened in the early morning hours to find that her wedding ring had been removed from her finger while she slept. The ring, a family heirloom passed down through 3 generations, was discovered the following morning, balanced carefully on the edge of her wash basin, positioned in such a way that it would have fallen to the floor with the slightest vibration. The psychological impact of this incident exceeded anything that had come before. The removal of a ring from someone's finger while they slept required a level of proximity and delicacy that suggested not random theft, but deliberate violation of the most intimate boundaries. Charles Witmore immediately increased security measures, installing additional locks on bedroom doors and arranging for armed guards to patrol the grounds throughout the night. Yet even these precautions failed to provide the sense of safety that the family sought. The incidents continued, but now they took on an even more personal and psychologically invasive character. Margaret Witmore would wake to find that her hair had been braided during the night in patterns she did not recognize. Articles of clothing would be found arranged in specific configurations that seemed to carry meaning she could not decipher. Personal letters would be discovered in different locations than where they had been left, though nothing appeared to be missing from their contents. The effect on the household was profound. The children began experiencing difficulty sleeping, reporting sounds in the walls and shadows that moved independently of any light source. Charles Witmore found himself checking and rechecking locks, examining windows for signs of intrusion, and questioning everyone who had access to the house about their movements and observations. Throughout this period, Amara Bell maintained her position as Margaret Witmore's personal attendant, continuing to perform her duties with the same quiet efficiency that had always characterized her work. If anything, she seemed to anticipate her mistress's needs with even greater accuracy, arriving with remedies for headaches before they were mentioned, suggesting schedule changes that proved beneficial and offering comfort during moments of particular distress. The investigation into these incidents revealed several troubling facts about the household's security. Despite the presence of guards and the installation of additional locks, there were numerous ways for someone with intimate knowledge of the building's layout to move through the house undetected. Servant passages, originally designed to allow domestic work to be conducted without disturbing the family, created a network of concealed routes between rooms. Additionally, the age of the building meant that floorboards and walls had settled in ways that created gaps and openings that were not immediately visible, but could be exploited by someone of small stature. More disturbing was the discovery that several of the household's keys had been duplicated using methods that required both skill and access to materials not readily available to the enslaved population. Wax impressions had been made of the original keys, and copies had been created using metal that appeared to have been melted down from other sources. The precision of these duplicates suggested someone with considerable knowledge of metalworking techniques and access to the necessary tools. The search for these tools led to a shocking discovery in the basement of the main house. Hidden beneath loose floorboards in a storage area that had not been accessed for several years, investigators found a collection of items that defied explanation. There were detailed diagrams of the house's layout, including rooms and passages that did not appear on any official architectural plans. There were sketches of family members engaged in private activities, drawn with an accuracy that suggested the artist had observed these scenes directly. Most disturbing of all, there was a collection of personal items belonging to each family member, arranged in a configuration that seemed to represent some form of inventory or catalogue. The discovery of this cache raised questions that Charles Witmore found deeply troubling. How long had someone been conducting this level of surveillance on his family? Who possessed the skills necessary to create such detailed observations while remaining completely undetected? And what was the ultimate purpose of gathering such comprehensive information about their most private moments and personal habits? The investigation took on new urgency as it became clear that what they had initially dismissed as petty theft was actually evidence of a far more sophisticated and potentially dangerous situation. The level of planning and patience required to conduct such extensive surveillance suggested someone with both the intelligence to conceive such an operation and the emotional discipline to execute it over an extended period. Charles Witmore hired additional security personnel and began conducting regular searches of all buildings on the estate. He also initiated a review of the backgrounds of everyone who had worked for the family, looking for any connections or relationships that might explain how someone had gained such intimate access to their lives. The results of this investigation would prove more disturbing than anything they had yet discovered. The records revealed that Amara Bell's previous owner, the plantation from which she had been purchased 7 years earlier, had experienced a series of mysterious incidents in the months before her sale. Livestock had died under circumstances that veterinarians could not explain. Crops had failed in patterns that seemed to defy agricultural logic. Most significantly, the plantation owner's wife had begun experiencing episodes of illness that physicians attributed to nervous exhaustion, but which had no clear medical cause. These incidents had ceased immediately after Amara's departure, but at the time, no connection had been made between her presence and the strange occurrences. It was only when viewed in the context of the current situation that a pattern began to emerge, suggesting a level of psychological manipulation that was both subtle and devastating in its effects. Further investigation revealed that Amara had been moved between several households before her arrival in Savannah, and that each of these previous placements had ended under circumstances that, while not obviously connected to her presence, had created situations that ultimately benefited her position or improved her circumstances. A pattern emerged of households that experienced increasing tension and discord, leading to sales or transfers that moved her closer to urban areas where opportunities for education and advancement were greater. The sophistication of this pattern suggested someone with an understanding of human psychology that went far beyond what might be expected from someone in her circumstances. The incidents were always designed to create maximum psychological impact while remaining technically explicable through conventional means. The timing was calculated to occur when family members were most vulnerable, and the effects were cumulative, building over time to create an atmosphere of constant unease and suspicion. As autumn approached, the situation in the Witmore household had deteriorated to the point where family members were reluctant to be alone in any part of the house. The children had been sent to stay with relatives in Charleston, and Margaret Witmore spent increasingly long periods visiting friends rather than remaining at home. Charles Witmore found himself conducting his business affairs from locations outside the house, returning only for brief periods and never without ensuring that multiple other people were present. The psychological toll was evident in the physical changes that friends and associates began to notice in the family members. Margaret Witmore had lost considerable weight and displayed signs of chronic exhaustion. Charles Witmore appeared constantly alert, examining his surroundings with the hypervigilance of someone who expected threat from any direction. Even their social interactions began to reflect the strain, as they became reluctant to host gatherings or accept invitations that would require them to be away from home after dark. It was during this period that several members of the enslaved community began reporting their own experiences with unexplained incidents. Tools would be found in different locations than where they had been left. Personal belongings would disappear and reappear with slight modifications that suggested they had been examined or used by someone else. Conversations would be interrupted by sounds that seemed to come from empty rooms or unoccupied areas of the buildings. Most significantly, several workers reported feeling watched during their daily activities, particularly during moments when they believed themselves to be alone. The sensation was described as persistent and unnerving, creating an atmosphere in which even routine tasks became sources of anxiety and stress. These reports created additional complications for the investigation, as they suggested that whatever was happening in the household was affecting everyone, regardless of their position within the social hierarchy. The incidents were not limited to the family members, but extended to anyone who spent significant time on the estate grounds. The broader implications of this discovery were troubling for Charles Witmore, as it suggested that the security measures he had implemented were inadequate to protect anyone within the household from whatever force was creating these disturbances. The realization that his efforts to create safety had failed to protect even those who worked for him created additional feelings of responsibility and frustration. As October arrived, bringing with it the first relief from the oppressive summer heat, the incidents in the Witmore household entered a new phase. Rather than the subtle psychological manipulations that had characterized the previous months, the events became more direct and immediately threatening. Personal items began appearing in locations that required considerable effort and risk to access. Family photographs were found arranged in specific patterns in rooms that had been locked and secured. Most disturbing of all, messages began appearing written in what appeared to be Margaret Witmore's own handwriting, but containing content that she insisted she had never written. These messages were discovered in various locations throughout the house, always written on paper that belonged to the family, and in handwriting that was virtually identical to Margaret Witmore's own. The content of the messages was deeply personal, referencing private conversations and intimate details about family relationships that would be known only to immediate family members. Yet the tone and perspective of the writing was alien, as if someone else was using her voice to express thoughts and feelings that were not her own. The psychological impact of receiving messages written in her own handwriting, but containing thoughts she had never expressed, created a level of distress in Margaret Witmore that exceeded anything she had previously experienced. The messages seemed designed to make her question her own memory and perception of events, creating doubt about her ability to distinguish between her own thoughts and those that were being attributed to her. Charles Witmore consulted with physicians about his wife's condition, but the medical professionals could find no evidence of physical illness or mental instability that would explain her symptoms. Her distress appeared to be a rational response to genuinely disturbing circumstances, rather than a manifestation of any underlying health condition. The investigation into the source of these messages revealed handwriting analysis that confirmed Margaret Witmore's suspicions. While the writing appeared to match her style in most respects, there were subtle differences in letter formation and pen pressure that suggested someone else had created the text. The precision of the imitation indicated extensive study of her handwriting patterns and considerable practice in reproducing her style. This discovery raised new questions about the level of access that someone had gained to the family's personal documents and correspondence. The accuracy of the imitation suggested that the perpetrator had spent considerable time examining samples of Margaret Witmore's writing, studying not only the formation of individual letters, but also the rhythm and flow of her natural writing style. The search for these writing samples led to another disturbing discovery. In Margaret Witmore's private study, investigators found evidence that her personal correspondence had been systematically examined and copied. Letters that she had written but not yet sent had been opened and resealed with such skill that the tampering was nearly undetectable. Drafts of personal notes had been photographed or traced, and even her daily journal showed signs of having been read by someone other than herself. The violation of her most private thoughts and communications created a sense of exposure and vulnerability that affected every aspect of Margaret Witmore's daily life. The knowledge that someone had read her most personal reflections and intimate correspondence made her reluctant to commit any thoughts to writing, effectively silencing one of her primary means of processing the stress and confusion she was experiencing. As November progressed, the incidents began to occur with greater frequency and intensity. The family's daily routines became increasingly disrupted as they attempted to maintain security measures that were proving inadequate against an adversary who seemed to possess unlimited access to their private spaces. Sleep became difficult for all family members, as the knowledge that someone could enter their rooms undetected made rest impossible. The financial cost of maintaining increased security was becoming significant, but the psychological cost was proving even more burdensome. The constant state of alertness required to monitor for threats was exhausting, and the inability to identify or confront the source of the disturbances created a sense of helplessness that pervaded every aspect of their lives. It was during this period that Charles Witmore made the decision to conduct a comprehensive investigation of everyone who had access to the household, regardless of their position or length of service. The investigation would include detailed background checks, interviews with previous employers, and examination of any personal effects or living spaces within the estate grounds. The scope of this investigation reflected the desperation that the family was experiencing, as it represented a level of scrutiny that violated the privacy and dignity of people who had served the household faithfully for many years. Yet the alternative, continuing to live in constant fear and uncertainty, had become intolerable. The investigation began with the senior household staff and worked systematically through everyone who had regular access to the main house. Each person was interviewed individually about their observations, their knowledge of the incidents, and their awareness of any suspicious activities or behaviors among their fellow workers. The interviews revealed a complex web of relationships and tensions within the household that had not been apparent to the family members. There were long-standing resentments between different groups of workers, competition for preferred assignments and living arrangements, and informal hierarchies that created systems of loyalty and obligation that existed independently of the official household structure. Most significantly, the interviews revealed that many workers had observed behaviors and incidents that they had not reported to the family members, either because they feared the consequences of bringing negative attention to the household or because they did not believe their observations would be taken seriously. Several workers reported that Amara Bell had been asking detailed questions about the family's habits and routines that seemed to go beyond what would be necessary for her assigned duties. She had inquired about the timing of family meals, the schedules of various household activities, and the locations where important items were stored. While these questions had not seemed suspicious at the time, viewed in the context of the current investigation, they suggested a level of interest in the family's private affairs that warranted further examination. Other workers reported observing Amara in areas of the house where her duties did not typically require her presence. She had been seen entering rooms that were normally off-limits to household staff, and she had been observed examining personal items and documents during times when the family members were away from the house. Most disturbing of all, several workers reported that Amara had asked them to provide information about their own observations of the family's activities, requesting details about conversations they might have overheard or behaviors they had witnessed. She had framed these inquiries as concern for the family's well-being, but the specificity of her questions suggested motives that went beyond simple worry. The investigation also revealed that Amara had developed relationships with workers in other households throughout Savannah, creating a network of contacts that could potentially provide information about the activities and vulnerabilities of other prominent families. The extent of this network suggested a level of strategic planning that was both sophisticated and potentially very dangerous. When confronted with these findings, Amara initially maintained the same quiet demeanor that had characterized her interactions with the family for 7 years. She answered questions politely and provided explanations for her behavior that were plausible on the surface, but did not address the underlying patterns that had been identified. However, as the questioning continued and the evidence was presented in greater detail, subtle changes began to appear in her responses. Her explanations became more elaborate and defensive, and she began to display knowledge of details about the family's private affairs that exceeded what she should have known through her legitimate duties. Most significantly, When asked about specific incidents that had occurred in the household, she provided information that had not been shared with anyone outside the immediate family. Her knowledge of these details indicated that she had been observing family members during their most private moments, gaining access to information through means that violated every boundary of appropriate behavior. The realization that someone had been conducting such comprehensive surveillance of their private lives for an extended period created a level of violation and betrayal that the family found difficult to comprehend. The knowledge that their most intimate moments had been observed and recorded by someone they had trusted with access to their home created feelings of exposure and vulnerability that would affect their sense of security for years to come. As the investigation continued into December, additional evidence emerged that revealed the full scope of what Amara had accomplished during her time with the family. Hidden caches of documents and personal items were discovered in various locations throughout the estate, each containing detailed information about the family's activities, relationships, and vulnerabilities. The documents included maps of the house with notations about the family members' daily routines, detailed observations about their personal habits and preferences, and analyses of their relationships with friends and business associates. There were also copies of personal correspondence, financial records, and legal documents that had been obtained through methods that demonstrated considerable skill and patience. Perhaps most disturbing of all, there were detailed plans for what appeared to be future activities designed to create maximum disruption and distress for the family. These plans included specific scenarios for creating public embarrassment, financial difficulties, and social isolation, all designed to be implemented in ways that would be difficult to trace back to their source. The sophistication of these plans indicated that what the family had experienced over the previous months was not random harassment, but rather a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to achieve specific objectives. The psychological manipulation they had endured was apparently intended as preparation for more serious actions that would have had long-lasting consequences for their reputation and well-being. The discovery of these plans created immediate concern about other families who might be vulnerable to similar treatment. The investigation expanded to include warnings to other prominent households in Savannah about the potential for this type of sophisticated psychological manipulation and the importance of implementing security measures that went beyond traditional concerns about theft or physical intrusion. When Amara was finally confronted with the full evidence of her activities, her response revealed the intelligence and determination that had made her actions so effective. Rather than denying her involvement or attempting to minimize the significance of what she had done, she acknowledged her actions with a composure that was both impressive and deeply disturbing. She explained that her activities had been motivated by a desire to understand and ultimately control the environment in which she was forced to live. The psychological manipulation had been her way of asserting power in a situation where she had been denied any legitimate means of self-determination or self-protection. Her explanation revealed a sophisticated understanding of human psychology and social dynamics that had enabled her to identify and exploit the vulnerabilities of each family member with surgical precision. The incidents had been designed not simply to create fear or discomfort, but to systematically undermine the family's sense of security and control over their own environment. The revelation of her motives and methods created complex feelings among those who had been investigating the case. While her actions had clearly violated every boundary of appropriate behavior and had caused considerable distress to innocent people, the intelligence and determination she had displayed commanded a certain level of respect, even from those who had been her victims. The legal proceedings that followed were complicated by the limited options available for addressing crimes committed by enslaved individuals. The evidence of her actions was overwhelming, but the legal system of 1852 provided few alternatives between minor punishment and extreme measures that seemed disproportionate to crimes that, while psychologically devastating, had not resulted in physical harm or significant financial loss. Charles Witmore found himself in the difficult position of seeking justice for the violations his family had endured, while recognizing that Amara's actions, however inappropriate, had been motivated by circumstances that he had played a role in creating. The moral complexities of the situation made it difficult to pursue remedies that felt both appropriate and just. The case attracted attention from other members of Savannah's prominent families, many of whom began implementing their own security measures based on the lessons learned from the Witmore family's experience. The realization that traditional security measures were inadequate against someone with intimate knowledge of household routines and access to private spaces led to significant changes in how domestic relationships were managed and monitored. The investigation also revealed the existence of informal networks of communication among enslaved individuals that operated independently of the official household structures. These networks had enabled Amara to gather information and coordinate activities in ways that had been completely invisible to the families who employed these workers. The discovery of these networks created additional concerns about the potential for coordinated actions that could affect multiple households simultaneously. The realization that domestic workers possessed both the intelligence and the organizational capability to conduct sophisticated operations created anxiety among slave owners that extended far beyond the specific circumstances of the Witmore case. In early 1853, approximately 6 months after the investigation had begun, Amara Bell was sold to a plantation owner in the interior regions of Georgia, far from the urban environment that had provided opportunities for the type of activities she had conducted in Savannah. The sale was conducted quietly, without public acknowledgement of the circumstances that had led to her removal from the Witmore household. The family attempted to return to normal routines, but the psychological effects of their experience continued to influence their daily lives for years afterward. Margaret Witmore never again felt completely comfortable in her own home, and she continued to experience anxiety about privacy and security that affected her social interactions and personal relationships. Charles Witmore implemented security measures that went far beyond anything that had been considered necessary before their experience with Amara. These measures included restrictions on access to private areas of the house, supervision of domestic workers during all activities, and regular searches of living areas and personal effects. The children, who had been sent away during the most difficult period, returned to find a household that had been fundamentally changed by their experience. The trust and openness that had previously characterized family relationships had been replaced by caution and vigilance that created emotional distance even among immediate family members. The case became a subject of discussion among Savannah's prominent families, but the details were rarely spoken of directly. The violation of privacy and the psychological manipulation that the family had endured created a sense of vulnerability that extended beyond the immediate victims to affect anyone who employed domestic workers in similar circumstances. The broader implications of the case contributed to changes in how domestic relationships were managed throughout the region. Families began implementing more systematic approaches to background investigations, supervision of household staff, and security measures designed to prevent similar incidents. However, these changes also created additional tensions and distrust that affected relationships between families and their domestic workers, many of whom had served faithfully for years without any indication of problems. The increased suspicion and surveillance created working conditions that were more restrictive and stressful for everyone involved. Years later, when slavery ended and former enslaved individuals were free to speak about their experiences, additional details about Amara Bell's activities began to emerge. Former workers from various households reported that she had been part of a broader network of individuals who shared information and strategies for dealing with the psychological pressures of their circumstances. These revelations suggested that what had happened in the Witmore household was not an isolated incident, but rather part of a larger pattern of resistance and psychological warfare that had been conducted by enslaved individuals who possessed the intelligence and determination to fight back against their circumstances in sophisticated ways. The documentation of these activities provided historians with insights into the complex psychological dynamics that existed within domestic relationships during this period. The case illustrated the ways in which individuals who were denied legitimate means of self-protection and self-determination could develop alternative strategies that were both effective and deeply disturbing. In 1868, 16 years after the original incidents, a fire at the Witmore estate led to the discovery of additional documents that had been hidden within the walls of the house during the original investigation. These documents contained even more detailed plans and observations that revealed the full extent of Amara's activities and her understanding of the family's vulnerabilities. The documents also contained correspondence with individuals in other cities, suggesting that her activities were part of a broader network of information sharing and strategic planning that extended far beyond Savannah. The sophistication of this network indicated that enslaved individuals had developed communication and organizational systems that were far more advanced than had been previously recognized. The discovery of these additional documents provided final confirmation of the scope and sophistication of what Amara Bell had accomplished during her time with the Witmore family. The psychological warfare she had conducted was revealed to be part of a larger campaign of resistance that had involved careful planning, strategic thinking, and coordination with others who shared her circumstances and her determination to assert some measure of control over their environment. The case of Amara Bell and the Witmore family became a documented example of the complex psychological dynamics that existed within domestic relationships during the antebellum period. It illustrated the ways in which individuals who appeared to be powerless could develop sophisticated strategies for psychological manipulation and control that were both effective and deeply disturbing. The documentation of these events provided important insights into the human capacity for strategic thinking and psychological warfare under extreme circumstances. It also revealed the limitations of traditional security measures against adversaries who possessed intimate knowledge of their targets and unlimited access to private spaces. The case continued to influence discussions about domestic security and the management of household relationships long after the specific circumstances had been resolved. The lessons learned from the Witmore family's experience contributed to changes in how families approached the complex challenges of maintaining both security and trust within their homes. The psychological impact of these events on all participants continued to influence their lives for years afterward. The Witmore family never fully recovered the sense of security and trust that they had lost during those months in 1852, and their experience served as a warning to others about the potential for sophisticated psychological manipulation by individuals who appeared to be powerless but possessed both intelligence and determination. The broader implications of the case extended beyond the immediate participants to influence social and legal discussions about the rights and responsibilities of all individuals within domestic relationships. The recognition that psychological warfare could be conducted by anyone with sufficient intelligence and determination led to increased awareness of the need for mutual respect and clear boundaries in all human relationships. The documentation of Amara Bell's activities also provided evidence of the remarkable human capacity for strategic thinking and psychological manipulation under extreme circumstances. Her ability to conduct such sophisticated operations while maintaining an appearance of complete compliance and cooperation demonstrated intellectual capabilities that challenged prevailing assumptions about the mental capacity of enslaved individuals. The case remains significant as a documented example of psychological warfare conducted by an individual who used her intelligence and determination to assert control over her environment in ways that violated every boundary of appropriate behavior while remaining technically within the bounds of actions that could be explained through conventional means. The legacy of these events continues to influence discussions about power, control, and psychological manipulation in human relationships. The sophistication of Amara's tactics and the psychological impact of her actions serve as reminders of the complex dynamics that can exist beneath the surface of apparently normal domestic relationships. The final documentation of this case was completed in 1869, when the last of the hidden documents were discovered and analyzed. The evidence revealed a level of strategic planning and psychological manipulation that exceeded anything that had been previously documented in similar circumstances. The case file was sealed and archived with instructions that it should not be opened for public review for 50 years. In order to protect the privacy of surviving family members, and to prevent the techniques that had been documented from being used as inspiration for similar activities by others. When the files were finally opened in 1919, historians and psychologists found detailed documentation of psychological manipulation techniques that were far more sophisticated than anything that had been previously studied. The case provided insights into human behavior and psychological warfare that contributed to academic understanding of these phenomena for decades afterward. The story of Amara Bell and the Witmore family serves as a reminder that the human capacity for intelligence, determination, and strategic thinking exists independently of social circumstances and external constraints. It illustrates both the potential for individuals to overcome seemingly impossible odds through careful planning and psychological manipulation, and the devastating impact that such activities can have on innocent victims who find themselves unable to defend against adversaries they cannot identify or understand. The most disturbing revelation came in 1923, when renovation work at a Charleston mansion uncovered a diary written in Amara Bell's distinctive handwriting. The journal, dated 1854 through 1856, documented her activities at the interior plantation where she had been sent after leaving Savannah. The entries revealed that her psychological campaign had not ended with her departure from the Witmore household. Instead, she had refined her techniques and applied them with even greater precision to her new environment. The plantation owner's family had experienced a series of incidents that followed the same pattern of escalating psychological manipulation that had terrorized the Witmores. More significantly, the diary contained detailed instructions for others who might wish to employ similar tactics. Written in a code that combined English letters with symbols that appeared to be of her own invention, the journal served as a comprehensive manual for psychological warfare conducted by individuals in positions of apparent powerlessness. The diary entries revealed that Amara viewed her activities not as random acts of revenge, but as systematic experiments in human psychology and social control. She had carefully documented the responses of her victims to different types of manipulation, analyzing which techniques were most effective under various circumstances and refining her methods based on the results she observed. The final entries in the diary, dated in late 1856, indicated that she was planning to escape from the plantation and make her way north to regions where slavery had been abolished. The last entry contained a single line written in her careful handwriting. The perfect slave knows that freedom begins in the mind of the master. No further records of Amara Bell's life have been discovered in official documents from the period following 1856. Whether she succeeded in her escape attempt or met some other fate remains unknown. The plantation where she had been living was abandoned during the economic disruptions that preceded the Civil War, and no reliable records of its final years have survived. The psychological techniques documented in her diary were studied by researchers who recognized their sophistication and effectiveness. The methods she had developed were found to be remarkably similar to psychological manipulation tactics that would not be formally recognized and studied by academic institutions until decades later. The case of Amara Bell represents one of the most thoroughly documented examples of psychological warfare conducted by an individual operating under extreme constraints. Her ability to maintain an appearance of complete compliance while conducting sophisticated campaigns of psychological manipulation demonstrated intellectual capabilities that challenged fundamental assumptions about human potential under oppressive circumstances. The impact of her activities extended far beyond her immediate victims to influence social and legal practices throughout the antebellum South. Families began implementing security measures and supervision practices that reflected the recognition that traditional assumptions about power and control in domestic relationships were inadequate against adversaries who possessed both intelligence and determination. The documentation of her case also contributed to later academic understanding of psychological manipulation, resistance strategies, and the complex dynamics of power relationships. Her techniques were studied by researchers interested in understanding how individuals could assert control over their environment through psychological rather than physical means. The legacy of Amara Bell's activities continues to influence discussions about power, intelligence, and resistance in human relationships. Her story serves as a reminder that the capacity for strategic thinking and psychological manipulation exists independently of social position or external circumstances, and that appearances of powerlessness can conceal remarkable capabilities for influence and control. The final chapter of this documented case was written not by historians or legal authorities, but by time itself, which buried the evidence of these remarkable events until changing social conditions made it possible to examine them with the perspective that historical distance provides. Today, the house that once belonged to the Witmore family stands empty on its lot near Forsyth Park, its windows boarded and its gardens overgrown. Visitors to Savannah pass by without knowing that within those walls, one woman conducted a campaign of psychological warfare that demonstrated both the remarkable capacity of the human mind for strategic thinking under impossible circumstances and the devastating impact such capabilities could have when applied without moral constraint. The Spanish moss still hangs from the oak trees that shade the property, moving silently in breezes that carry no memory of the whispered conversations and careful footsteps that once marked the passage of someone who understood that true power lies not in the ability to command, but in the capacity to make others question their own perception of reality. And perhaps, in the end, that was the most perfect slavery of all.